The bar on Waypoint Kareth 9 was the kind of place that never really closed. It sat at the belly of the station, 3 levels below the main docking ring, tucked between a fuel depot and a parts warehouse that smelled like burnt copper. The sign above the door had lost 2 of its letters years ago and nobody had bothered to fix them. The regulars called it the Belly, and the name had stuck the way bad nicknames always do. Inside it was loud the way only a frontier bar could be loud. Not just voices, though there were plenty of those, but the clatter of cups on metal tables, the hiss of the drink dispenser behind the bar, the low grinding music that came from a speaker mounted crooked on the far wall. 3 different card games were happening at once. 2 aliens from the draft system were arguing over a bet that had apparently been going on for 6 days. A group of cargo workers in the corner were laughing so hard that one of them had fallen off his stool and not yet gotten back up. Nobody looked at the door when it opened. That was the first thing about the Belly. People came and went all night. The door opened, the door closed. Nobody looked. That was the unspoken agreement of a place like this. You did not look, you did not ask, you minded your drink and your business and let everyone else mind theirs. So when the door opened just past the 9th hour, nobody looked. Then something changed in the air. It was hard to explain. It was not a sound or a smell. It was more like the feeling a room gets when the temperature drops without warning, a shift that the body notices before the brain does. Conversations slowed. Cups paused halfway to mouths. The draft aliens stopped arguing. The cargo workers stopped laughing. One by one the heads turned. She was young. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Young for a human would have meant teenage, unfinished, soft at the edges. Young for a Virith dragon meant something different. She was lean and tall, with the long limbs of her species, scaled from her jaw to her wrists in deep gray blue that caught the bar light and threw it back cold. Her wings were folded flat against her back, tight and controlled, the way a person holds their shoulders when they are working very hard not to show that they are nervous. Her eyes were gold. Not brown gold or yellow gold. True gold, the color of something molten and old, and they moved across the room with the sharp patience of a creature that had learned early to read spaces before entering them. She was not enormous. She was not breathing fire. She was not doing anything threatening at all. But the room had gone quiet anyway because something in the way she stood made the air feel smaller. She walked in like she had been planning this for a long time. Not fast. Not slow. She moved through the crowd and the crowd moved for her without quite deciding to, the way water moves around something dropped into it. The draft alien stepped aside. A table of miners leaned back in their chairs. The cargo worker who had fallen off his stool chose this moment to stay on the floor. She stopped in the middle of the room. For one moment she just stood there, looking. Her gold eyes moved across the tables, across the faces, and they were doing something that most people in the bar had not expected. They were searching. Not threatening. Searching. Like someone looking for a specific face in a crowd photograph they had studied for years. Then she reached to her belt. Half the room tensed. She drew a blade. It was short, more a long knife than a sword, and old in the way that things are old when they have been carried every day for a long time rather than locked away. The handle was worn smooth. The metal had the dull finish of something that had never been decorative. There were small markings near the base, etchings too small to read from a distance. She held it for one breath. Then she leaned forward and placed it flat on the nearest empty table. Not a threat. A statement. The sound it made when the metal hit the surface cut through what was left of the bar noise and finished the job of silencing the room completely. She straightened. She looked at the far corner of the bar, the human corner, where the cargo workers and route drivers and retired station hands had their usual cluster of tables, and she spoke in common tongue. Clear. Come. No shake in it at all. Which of you is my father? Nobody moved. The question sat in the middle of the room like the blade on the table, placed deliberately, waiting. The aliens looked at the humans. The humans looked at each other, or at their drinks, or at the wall, or at any fixed point that was not the young dragon girl standing in the center of the bar with gold eyes and a patience that felt like it had been built up over many years. A few of the humans were older men, the kind who had spent their lives on stations and cargo routes and had the faces to prove it. A few were younger, passing through. One woman near the back had gone very still with her cup raised halfway and had not moved since the door opened. None of them spoke. None of them in that first long moment looked like they were going to. Then one man set his cup down. He was sitting at the edge of the human corner, slightly apart from the others the way some people naturally sit, close enough to belong to a group, far enough to be their own thing. He was somewhere past 50, with a face that had been weathered by recycled station air for too many years. His hair had gone mostly gray. His hands on the table were the hands of someone who had done physical work for a long time and had the knuckles to show for it. He had not looked away when she walked in. He had not looked at his drink or the wall. He had watched her cross the room, watched her place the blade, watched her face while she said the words, and now he was looking at her with an expression that was not fear, not guilt, not the blank careful nothing that most of the other humans were wearing. He looked like a man who recognized something. Not her face, he did not know her face. Something else. Something in the way she was standing, or something about the blade on the table, or something he was carrying privately that had just connected to something he was seeing now. He did not stand up. He did not make any large movement that would draw more attention than the situation already had. He just looked at her steadily and said, in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through the silent bar, "Sit down. And I'll tell you what I know." She looked at him for a long moment. The whole bar looked at him for a long moment. He picked up his cup again, unhurried, and took a slow drink and set it back down and waited. Like a man who had learned somewhere along the way that the best thing you could do when something important was happening was to stay still and make it easy for the other person to come to you. She studied him. Her gold eyes moved over his face the way they had moved over the room, not threatening, reading, checking for something. Whatever she found or did not find, she made a decision. She crossed the room. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down in it without any particular grace, the way someone sits when they are too tired and too wound up to care about appearances. Her wings settled behind her. Her hands went flat on the table. She looked at him. "You are not him," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "I'm not." "Then why did you speak?" He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Because I worked the medical bay on this station 11 years ago. And I think I know who you are. And I think," he added carefully, "that you have been looking for a long time." Something moved behind her eyes. Just briefly. "There and gone." "Talk," she said. He nodded once. Behind them, the bar slowly, cautiously began to find its noise again. Drinks were picked back up. The music from the crooked speaker filled the air. The Drath aliens resumed their argument in lower voices. But at that one table in the corner, a young dragon girl with gold eyes and a worn blade sat across from an old station medic, and the long story of how she had ended up in this bar on this night in this part of the galaxy finally had somewhere to go. Arn did not rush. That was the first thing Sarah noticed about him. Most humans, when faced with a dragon asking uncomfortable questions, either talked too fast or went completely silent. This man did neither. He sat with the easy stillness of someone who had spent years in rooms where people were scared or hurt or angry, and had learned that the worst thing you could do in those rooms was add your own noise to theirs. He looked at the blade on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they have not seen in a long time but have thought about more than they expected to. Then he looked at her. "Before I say anything," he said, "I want you to know that I'm not going to lie to you. Not because I think you would hurt me." He glanced briefly at the blade. "Well, not only because of that, but because you came a long way to find a true answer, and a false one would be worse than no answer at all." Sarah said nothing. She was watching his face the way she had watched the room, steadily reading. He nodded as if her silence was answer enough. "My name is Arn," he said. "I worked the medical bay on this station for 11 years. I left the post about 3 years ago. Bad knees mostly. The station didn't argue too hard about letting me go." He said this without bitterness, just fact. "I come back here sometimes. The belly has the cheapest warm drink in the sector and I know most of the people, so." He wrapped both hands around his cup. 11 years ago," he said, "a man came into the medical bay at about the second hour of the night shift. I was the only one on at that point. Quiet night, which was rare. I remember that. I remember thinking it had been a quiet shift, and then the door opened." He paused. He was young. Mid-20s maybe. Human. He had the look of someone who had been running, not physically but in the way people run when something has happened that they don't know how to stop happening. His eyes were, Arn considered the word carefully, wrecked. That's the only way to put it. Not crying. Past crying. The kind of face a person has when they've already used everything up and they're still standing because they haven't figured out what else to do. Sarah had gone very still on her side of the table. She was not showing anything on her face. But she had stopped breathing quite the way she had been breathing before. "He was carrying something wrapped in a cargo blanket," Arn said. "A big bundle held against his chest the way you'd carry something fragile. He came straight to the desk and he put it down and he pulled the blanket back and—" Arn stopped. Looked at his cup for a second. "It was an egg," he said. "Dragon egg. I had only ever seen one before in a medical textbook, so it took me a moment. But there was no mistaking it once I understood what I was looking at. Gray-blue. About this big. He held his hands apart to show her. Warm. Oh. Not a crack in it. He said the mother had died in the Sector 4 mining collapse. 3 days before. He had been part of the recovery crew going into the lower tunnels, and he had found the egg in a chamber that had stayed sealed when the rest came down. He'd carried it out himself. Sarah's jaw had tightened slightly. Just slightly. He didn't know what to do, Arn said. That was the thing. He wasn't a bad man standing in front of me, he was a lost one. He had no family on the station. He had no money beyond his next wage. He knew nothing about raising a dragon young, and he said so plainly, which I respected. He said he was afraid that if he tried to keep the egg and do it wrong, he would cause more harm than if he found someone who knew what they were doing. He asked me if I knew a Virith elder. Someone who could take the egg and raise it properly. The bar hummed around them. Somewhere behind Sarah, a glass was set down too hard and a few voices laughed about it. Neither of them looked away from each other. I made some calls, Arn said. It took most of that night. But I found one, an elder 3 stations out who had raised young before and was willing to take another. Arrangements were made. Transport was organized. It was all settled by the morning shift. He picked up his cup. Put it back down without drinking. The man, your father, he stayed the whole night. In the waiting room. He didn't sleep. I checked on him a few times, offered him food which he didn't eat. He just sat there next to the egg with this look on his face like a man who is trying to memorize something before it's gone. And at some point during the night he asked me if I had anything he could use to carve with. Sarah's eyes dropped to the blade on the table. I gave him a tool from the maintenance kit, Arn said quietly. I didn't ask him why. It seemed like the kind of thing a person didn't need to explain. He worked on it for 2 nights. The transport was delayed by a day, whether on the route or something mechanical, I don't remember which. So he had more time than he expected. He sat in that waiting room for 2 nights while the egg stayed warm in the medical bay, and he carved. When the transport came, he wrapped the blade in the same cargo blanket the egg had been in. He tucked it alongside the egg carefully. He stood there for a while with his hand resting on the outside of the blanket without moving. Arn was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back. And he let them take it. The word it landed in the air between them, and Arn seemed to hear how it sounded, because he corrected himself without being asked. Let them take her, he said. He let them take her. And then he walked out of the medical bay, and I didn't see him again after that. Sarah had not moved in a long time. Her hands were flat on the table. Her gold eyes were fixed on Arn's face with an expression that was extremely careful and extremely controlled, and underneath that control was something that Arn had seen before, not in dragons but in people. The specific look of someone who has built a story about their own life out of the pieces they were given, and is now sitting in front of information that changes the shape of the whole thing. You said the blade, she said. Her voice was even. Measured. You recognized it? Yes. From 2 nights of watching him carve it? Yes. She looked down at it on the table. Then back at him. I thought it was a goodbye, she said. Not emotional. Stating a fact. I thought it meant, here is something so you know I existed. And then nothing. Arn nodded slowly. I understand why it looked that way. It is not what it was. No, Arn said. I don't think it is. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that follows something true being said out loud for the first time. Then Sarah asked the question that mattered. What was his name? Arn told her. Called her Voss. Mechanic. Quiet man. Had worked the station circuit for a few years after that night as far as Arn knew, then eventually moved on the way people did. Do you know where he is now? No, Arn said honestly. But, he tilted his head toward the bar, toward a broad-shouldered man who had been sitting 3 tables away for the last 20 minutes and had the focused expression of someone pretending very hard not to listen. Walt has run cargo routes through this sector longer than anyone I know. If anyone has a thread to pull, it's him. Sarah looked at the man called Walt. Walt looked back at her with the expression of someone caught, then shrugged one big shoulder as if to say yes, all right, fair enough. She looked back at Arn. Why are you helping me? She asked. Direct. No softness in it. Arn thought about it genuinely, which she could tell because he took a moment before answering instead of reaching for something easy. Because I watched a man spend 2 nights carving your name into that blade, he said. And I always wondered if you ever found out what it meant. Sarah looked at the blade on the table for a long moment. Then she picked it up and put it back at her belt. And she turned her chair toward Walt. Walt was not what Sarah had expected. She had expected someone who would make a performance of helping her. Someone who would lean back in his chair and tell the story slowly, enjoying the room's attention, making her wait for the parts that mattered. She had met that kind of person before, the ones who treated other people's pain like a stage they got to stand on. Walt was not that. He pulled his chair over to their table without fanfare, sat down with the heaviness of a man whose body had done a lot of kilometers and felt every one of them, and got straight to the point. "Calder Voss," he said. "Yeah. I knew him." Sarah's eyes locked onto his face. "Not well," Walt added, because he was clearly the kind of man who did not like saying more than was accurate. "You don't get to know people well on station circuits. You see them, you exchange maybe 30 words about cargo weights and route conditions, you move on. But I ran the same corridor as him for," he thought about it, "3 seasons maybe. You notice the same faces after a while." "What do you remember?" Sarah asked. Walt turned his cup in a slow circle on the table, thinking. "Quiet," he said. "That's the first word. Not unfriendly quiet. Some people are quiet because they don't like you. He wasn't like that. He'd help you without being asked. If your cargo seal was giving trouble at a checkpoint, he'd just come over and fix it without making a thing of it. Good hands. The mechanical kind of good, the kind you're born with that you can't really teach someone." He paused. He didn't talk about himself. Ever. You'd work alongside a man for 3 seasons and normally you'd pick up pieces, family, where he came from, something. With Calder I got nothing. Not because he was rude about it. He just redirected. You'd ask him something personal and somehow the conversation would be somewhere else before you noticed. "That bothered you?" Arn asked. Walt shook his head. "Not bothered. Just noticed. There's a difference between a man who has nothing to say and a man who has decided not to say it. Calder was the second kind." He looked at Sarah directly. "After the 3rd season he didn't come back to the circuit. That happens, people change routes, take other work, move on. I didn't think much of it at the time." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Later I heard through someone, I can't even remember who now, just corridor talk, that he had taken a ground posting. Somewhere quieter. A farming colony. Veritha's Reach," Sarah said. Walt looked at her with mild surprise. Then at Arn. "She just worked it out from what you said," Arn told him. Walt looked back at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but the adjustment a person makes when they realize they have slightly underestimated someone. "Veritha's Reach," he confirmed. 2 systems east. Small place. Agricultural mostly. The kind of colony people go to when they want to stop moving." He paused. "I run that corridor. I can take you." Sarah studied him the same way she had studied Arn, steadily looking for the thing underneath the offer. "Why?" she asked. Walt did not look offended by the question. He seemed to have expected it. "Because," he said slowly, "you walked into this bar tonight and you did something that most people never do. You asked the hardest question you had out loud in front of strangers, without knowing what the answer was going to be." He picked up his cup. "That takes something. And the least a person can do when they see something like that, is not make it harder." He drank. Set the cup down. "I leave in 2 days," he said. "Docking Bay 7. Be there or don't." He moved his chair back to his own table, picked up a worn deck of cards from his jacket pocket, and began dealing himself a solitary game as if the conversation had been perfectly ordinary. Sarah watched him for a moment. Then she turned back to Arn. "And you," she said. "You have no reason to come." Arn shrugged one shoulder. "Probably not. You already told me what you know. Your part is finished." "That's true." She waited. He drank from his cup, looked at the middle distance and said nothing else. She decided not to push it. The docking bay at the 7th hour of the morning was cold and smelled like fuel and metal. Walt's cargo hauler was not a beautiful ship. It was large and practical in the way that working tools are practical. Built for function, maintained carefully, not a single thing on it that existed for any reason other than doing its job. The cargo hold was half full of sealed supply crates going to 3 different colonies along the eastern corridor. The passenger cabin behind the cockpit had 2 extra seats that were technically for crew but were rarely used. Walt was already running pre-flight checks when Sarah arrived. He looked at her once, nodded, and went back to his instruments. She put her bag in the hold and found one of the passenger seats and sat in it and did not speak. 10 minutes later, boots sounded on the docking ramp. Arn appeared in the cabin doorway with a travel bag over one shoulder and a thermos in his hand. He was wearing a slightly better jacket than the night before, which suggested he had gone back to wherever he was staying, slept at least a few hours and made a decision somewhere in the middle of the night. Sarah looked at him. He looked at her. "Don't," he said pleasantly, "say anything." She didn't. He took the other passenger's seat, opened his thermos and offered it to Walt first, then to her. Walt took some. Sarah looked at the thermos for a moment, then took it, drank, handed it back. It was something warm and slightly bitter and not unpleasant. The ship left the station without ceremony. The journey was 2 days. Sarah had expected it to feel long. She had spent a lot of time alone in her life. Dragon young were not kept in groups the way some species raised their children, and her elder had been loving but quiet, which meant Sarah had grown up comfortable with silence. She had thought 2 days in a small ship with 2 humans she barely knew would be tolerable at best. It was not what she expected. Walt talked while he flew. Not at her specifically, he talked the way some people do when they are comfortable, filling the air around him with observations and old stories and occasional bad jokes that he seemed to find funnier than anyone else did. He did not demand responses. He did not seem to need them. He just talked, and somehow the talking made the small cabin feel less small. Arn was quieter, but occasionally said something that turned Walt's stories in a new direction, and the two of them had the easy rhythm of people who had maybe not known each other long but recognized a similar wavelength. Sarah listened. She did not mean to. She had planned to spend the journey in her own head, turning the information over, preparing herself for whatever Veritha's reach was going to bring. But somewhere in the first few hours she found that she had stopped planning and started listening, and the conversation washing over her was doing something she had not expected. It was making the tightness in her chest slightly less tight. On the first evening, Walt cooked something in the small galley that smelled better than it had any right to, given what the supply cabinet contained. He put a portion in front of Sarah without asking if she wanted it. She looked at it. She was hungry. She had not eaten since before the bar. She ate it. She did not say thank you. Walt did not seem to require it. On the second day, somewhere in the quieter stretch between systems, Sarah took out the blade. She held it in both hands and looked at the etchings near the base. She had looked at them 1,000 times in her life and they had always meant the same thing to her. A mark left by someone leaving. An exit signature. She looked at them now and tried to see them differently. 2 sets of initials. His and hers. The name he had given her before her elder had changed it. A name she had not known was hers until 2 nights ago. He had carved her name into the only thing he could send with her. She turned that over in her mind slowly, the way a stone gets turned over to see what is underneath. Walt glanced back from the cockpit and saw the blade in her hands. He said nothing. He turned back to his instruments. Arn, in the seat beside her, looked at it briefly and then looked out the small viewport at the stars. Nobody asked her what she was thinking. She was grateful for that in a way she could not have explained and did not try to. The ship flew east. Anne Veritha's reach got closer with every hour, waiting on the other side of the dark like an answer she had not yet decided how to hold. Veritha's reach was exactly the kind of place a person went when they were done with noise. It was small in the way that frontier colonies are small, not crowded small but sparse small, like someone had taken a handful of buildings and dropped them carefully across a wide flat landscape with plenty of space between each one. The fields stretched out in every direction, low crops moving in a warm wind that smelled like dirt and growing things. The sky above was a pale washed-out blue, the kind that comes from a sun that is slightly further away than average. Everything about the place was quiet and unhurried and deliberate. Walt brought the ship down on the small landing strip at the colony's edge and cut the engines. For a moment none of them moved. Sarah was looking out the viewport at the settlement ahead. Her hands were on her knees. Her jaw was set in the careful way it had been set for most of the journey, controlled, forward-facing, not giving anything away. "You don't have to decide anything today," Arn said quietly from the seat beside her. "You don't have to walk away with anything resolved. You just have to walk in." She did not respond. But after a moment she stood up, took her bag from the hold and went down the ramp. Walt and Arn followed at a distance that said clearly, "We are here but this is yours." The repair shop was at the far edge of the settlement, which made sense. Repair work was noisy and the kind of colony that valued quiet put its noisy things at the edges. It was a low building, practical, with tools hung on the outside wall in careful order and a workbench set up just outside the main door to catch the natural light. A man was working at that bench when they came up the road. He was bent over something mechanical, some kind of atmospheric regulator from the look of it, the casing open, his hands moving inside it with the focused patience of someone who had done this kind of work for so long that his hands knew what to do without being told. His hair was gray, nearly white at the temples. His shoulders had the slight curve of a man who had spent decades bending over workbenches. His hands were dark with grease up to the wrists. He had not heard them yet. The wind was coming from behind them and the colony's ambient noise covered their footsteps on the dirt road. Sarah stopped about 20 feet away. She stood there and looked at him. This was the moment she had been moving toward for, how long? Officially 3 days since Kareth, 9. Really her whole life. Since the first time she was old enough to understand that other young in her elder's nest had a bloodline story and she did not. Since the first time she had held the blade and asked her elder where it came from and received an answer that was kind but incomplete. The man at the workbench had not looked up. She took a breath. She took one step forward. And the man's hands went still. He had felt something, some shift in the air, some instinct that people who have been waiting for something develop without knowing it. He straightened slowly. He set down the tool in his hand with care, the way a person sets something down when they want their hands to be empty. And then he turned around. He saw Walt first, then Arn. Then he saw her. His face did something complicated. It moved through several things in quick succession. Recognition, shock, something that looked almost like pain, and then underneath all of it, something quieter and harder to name. Something that had been waiting a long time to happen and was now happening and did not know yet if that was going to be all right. His mouth opened. He said a name. Not Sarah. The other name. The one from the registry. The one she had not known was hers until 2 nights ago in a station bar. She went completely still. He knew her name. Her original name. Of course he did, he had given it to her. But hearing it said out loud, in his voice, in this moment, by this specific man, was something she had not prepared for and could not have prepared for. "You know me," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "Yes," Calder Voss said. He looked older than she had imagined when she had tried, over the years, to build a picture of him from nothing. His face had the deep lines of someone who had spent a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time thinking. His eyes were a plain gray-brown, unremarkable in color, but they were looking at her with an intensity that made the color irrelevant. He did not run. He did not make excuses. He did not reach for the kind of immediate defensive explanation that people reach for when they are caught at something. He just stood there and looked at her and let her look at him, like a man who had decided a long time ago that if this day ever came he would not flinch from it. Sarah walked forward until she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. Then she told him. She had planned it carefully over 2 days of travel. Not a speech, not cruelty, just the truth delivered plainly. She told him what it was to grow up as the only one without a bloodline story. She told him about the questions other young asked that she could not answer. She told him about the blade, how she had carried it her whole life thinking it meant goodbye, thinking it was the mark of someone who had decided she was not worth staying for. She told him about the specific loneliness of not knowing if she had been abandoned or lost or simply not wanted enough, and how not knowing was in some ways worse than any answer would have been, because not knowing meant she had to invent the answer herself and the answer she invented was never kind. She said all of it without her voice breaking. Dragons did not break easily and she had been carrying this a long time, and she had gotten very good at holding it. Calder listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. He did not do the thing that people sometimes do when they are uncomfortable with difficult truth. He did not let his eyes drift, did not shift his weight, did not signal in any small way that he wanted her to stop or soften it or get to the end faster. He just listened. Like a man paying a debt he had known was coming. When she finished, the wind moved through the space between them and the crops in the fields nearby made their low rustling sound. Then Calder said, "Wait here." He went inside. Sarah did not move. Walt and Arn, still at a respectful distance down the road, also did not move. Nobody spoke. Calder came back out after a few minutes carrying a box. It was not large, about the size of a small document case, dark metal, old, with a simple lock on the front that he opened with a key he kept on a cord around his neck. He set it on the workbench and he stepped back and he nodded at it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the box. Then she stepped forward and looked inside. There were papers. A lot of papers, organized with a carefulness that said they had been handled many times and put back in the same order every time. Colony registry copies. Her registration, her transfer documents, all of it. And then below that, something she had not expected. Reports. Growth reports. Sent from her elder station, dated 4 times a year, going back more than a decade. Her height at different ages. Her training progress. Her health. Written in her elder's careful hand and addressed to a name she now knew was Calder Voss at a series of different station addresses before the address settled to Veritha's reach. He had written to ask. Her elder had agreed to send news. He had been reading about her life 4 times a year for 10 years. She lifted one of the reports and held it. The paper was worn soft at the folds from being opened and refolded many times. Below the reports were drawings. Rough pencil sketches on plain paper, many of them each one dated. A dragon child at 2 cycles. At 5. At 8. At 12. They were not skillful drawings, they were the drawings of a man who had no talent for it and did it anyway, working from imagination, trying to picture what she looked like at different points in her life. Some of them were not very close. Some of them, in the eyes, were closer than she would have expected. At the bottom of the box was a letter. A single folded piece of paper, the fold lines deep and soft from years of being taken out and put back. She could see from the outside that it was dense with writing. She could see her name at the top, her original name, his name for her. She did not open it. Not yet. She stood at the workbench with the letter in her hands and she was quiet for a long time. "You followed my life," she said finally. "Yes," Calder said. "From the only distance I thought I had the right to." She turned to look at him. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." He did not say anything else. He did not dress it up or soften it or explain it into something better than it was. He let the answer be as plain and insufficient as it was, because she deserved at least that much honesty. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the box. There was a whole life in there. Hers, seen from a distance, by someone who had never stopped looking. She had come to Veritha's reach not knowing what she would do when she found him. She still did not know. But she was beginning to understand that the answer she had invented for herself, the one that said she had not been wanted enough, was not the right answer. It was not the right answer at all. Sarah walked outside. She did not say anything to Calder before she left. She did not say anything to Walt or Arn either. She just turned from the workbench, walked past them, and kept walking until she was around the side of the repair shop and out of sight of everyone. There was a low wall there, the kind that marked the edge of a property without really keeping anything in or out. Beyond it, the field started. Low green crops moving in the warm wind, stretching out flat and wide toward the horizon. The sky above was still that pale washed-out blue. A bird of some kind, local to this colony, was making a sound somewhere in the distance that was almost like a question repeated over and over. Sarah sat on the wall. She put her bag on the ground beside her. She rested her elbows on her knees and looked at the fields and breathed, slowly and deliberately, the way she had been taught to breathe when something was happening inside her chest that was too big to let out all at once. After a while she reached to her belt and took out the blade. She held it flat across both palms the way she had held it on the ship, the way she had held it 100 times before in her life when she needed to think and her hands needed something to do. The metal was warm from being against her body. The handle was worn smooth in exactly the places her grip naturally fell, which meant it had been shaped, over the years, to fit her specifically. She had never thought about that before. That the handle had changed to fit her. She looked at the etchings near the base. She had looked at them so many times that she could have drawn them from memory. Small marks, carefully made, close together near where the blade met the handle. She had always assumed they were decorative. Some kind of pattern or symbol. Her elder had not known what they were. A trader she had once asked said they looked like station script but too small and irregular to read with confidence. Now she knew what they were. 2 sets of initials. His and hers. She bent her head and looked at them closely, closer than she usually did. In the open daylight of Veritha's reach, without the low bar lighting of Careth 9 or the dim cabin light of Walt's ship, she could see the marks more clearly than she ever had before. They were small. Uneven. The lines were not perfectly straight. Some of them curved slightly where a hand had moved with less control than intended. Shaking hands, Arn had said. He had been shaking. She thought about that. A young man, mid-20s, sitting alone in a medical bay waiting room in the middle of the night. An egg in the next room that was not his by blood but that he had carried out of a collapsed mine with his own body. A transport coming in the morning to take it away to someone who could raise it properly. 2 nights in a waiting room. Shaking hands working a small tool across the base of a blade in the quiet of a station that was mostly asleep. She thought about what it would take to do that. Not the carving, the deciding. The deciding to carve her initials alongside his. The deciding that this small blade should carry both of them, connected, even though he had already determined that he could not be the one to stay. She had read the blade as a goodbye for her entire life. She had read it as, here is proof I existed, now I am leaving. She turned it over in her hands now and tried to read it differently. Here is proof you exist. Here is my name next to yours so that wherever you go, you carry the fact that you came from someone. So that you are never fully without a beginning. So that even if you never find me, you have this, 2 sets of initials pressed together in worn metal, saying we were both real and we were connected and that connection does not stop being true just because I am not there. That was a different thing entirely from goodbye. That was the opposite of goodbye. She sat with that for a long time. The bird in the distance kept making its repeating sound. The crops moved. The pale sky stayed pale. She thought about the box inside. The growth reports her elder had sent him 4 times a year. She thought about him opening each one, sitting somewhere at whatever address he was at during that season, unfolding the paper carefully, reading about her height and her training and her health. She thought about him folding the reports back up and putting them in the box and keeping them. Every single one. For over a decade. She thought about the drawings. The rough pencil sketches of a dragon child at different ages, made by a man with no talent for drawing who had drawn them anyway. Who had sat down with plain paper and a pencil and tried to imagine her face. Some of the drawings were not very close. But he had kept trying. He had drawn her at 2 cycles and at 5 and at 8 and at 12, and he had kept trying to get it right, kept trying to see her, even from a distance he had decided was the only one he deserved. That was not a man who had not cared. That was a man who had cared so completely that he had made every wrong choice trying to protect her from the fact that he was not enough. Who had looked at himself and seen someone insufficient, and then spent over a decade finding quiet ways to stay present in her life anyway, ways she would not feel and could not be hurt by. She understood now why she was not entirely angry. She was something definitely. There was a real and legitimate feeling in her chest that said, "You should have told me, you should have reached, you should have let me decide for myself whether you were enough." That feeling was true and she was not going to put it away. But underneath it was something else now. Something that had not been there before the box. She was trying to find the word for it. In the Virith language there was a word, old, not used much anymore, for the specific feeling of finding out that something you believed was a wound was actually a scar. That it had already healed in a way you had not noticed. That the damage was real and had happened and also, had already begun to close on its own without your permission. She did not know if there was a human word for that. She suspected there might not be. Humans were often better at feeling things than naming them. Footsteps came around the corner of the shop. Not Calder, she could tell by the weight and pace. Heavy boots, unhurried, the walk of a man who moved at the same speed in every situation because he had long ago decided that speed was rarely the answer. Walt came around the wall and stopped a few feet away from her. He did not sit. He put one hand on the top of the wall and stood beside her and looked out at the fields the same way she was looking at them. Like someone who had come to stand with her, not to talk at her. A full minute passed without either of them saying anything. Sarah appreciated that more than she could have said. She had always found that the people who rushed to fill silence were usually doing it for themselves, not for the person they were with. Walt looked at the blade in her hands. Not for long. Just a glance, the kind that acknowledged something without making a production of it. Then he looked back at the fields. He carved it himself, she said. She was not really saying it to Walt. She was saying it out loud because it needed to be said out loud to become more real than it currently was. In a waiting room. 2 nights. His hands were shaking. Walt said nothing. "I thought it meant he was leaving," she said. "I thought it was a door closing." She turned the blade in her hands one more time. Looked at the 2 sets of initials. His and hers. Pressed together in the metal like the answer to a question she had been asking her whole life in the wrong direction. "It was not a door closing," she said quietly. Walt nodded once, slowly. She looked up at the pale sky. She breathed out through her nose, long and slow. "I am not all right," she said. Plainly. Without drama. The way she said most things. "Right now in this moment I am not all right." Walt was quiet for a second. Then he said, "That's usually how it starts." She looked at him. He was not smiling exactly. But there was something in his face that was steady and unhurried and not at all sorry for her, which was exactly what she needed. Not pity. Not comfort that tried to make the feeling smaller. Just acknowledgement. That this was the beginning of something and beginnings were hard and that was normal and she was standing in it and that was enough. She looked back at the fields. She held the blade a moment longer. Then she put it back at her belt. And she sat there in the warm wind of Veritha's reach with Walt standing beside her in his unhurried way, and for the first time since she had walked into a crowded bar and slammed a blade on a table and asked a room full of strangers the hardest question she had, she let herself simply be still. It was not all right yet. But Walt had said that was how it started. And she believed him. Calder cooked. That was the first thing that happened when Sarah came back around the side of the repair shop with Walt walking a few steps behind her. Calder was standing in the doorway of the shop. And when he saw them coming he did not say anything grand or make any gesture that drew attention to the fact that she had needed to step away. He just looked at her once, steady and brief, and then he said, "I was going to make food. If that's all right." It was such a plain and ordinary thing to say. She had expected something weighted. Some large careful sentence about feelings or the future or what came next. Instead he was asking if he could make food. She said yes before she had decided to. The inside of the repair shop was split in two. The front half was work, tools on the walls in the same careful order as outside, a large work table, parts and labeled containers stacked on shelves that went up to the ceiling. The back half was living space. Small but not cramped. A cot, a table with 2 chairs, a small cooking unit in the corner, a single window that looked out over the field behind the building. There were only 2 chairs at the table. Calder disappeared outside briefly and came back with 2 more, borrowed from somewhere nearby, and he set them around the table without making a fuss about it and went to the cooking unit and started working. Arn sat. Walt sat. Sarah looked at the room. She looked at the shelves of parts, at the tools on the walls, at the small window and the field beyond it. She looked at the cot with its plain blanket folded neatly at the foot. She looked at the single cup on the small shelf above the cooking unit, and the single plate beside it, and the life that one person living quietly and alone had arranged around themselves in this back half of a repair shop at the edge of a farming colony at the far end of a long journey away from anywhere. She thought about what Arn had said on the ship. That Calder had confused guilt with humility. That he had stayed away not because he did not care but because he believed caring did not give him the right to disrupt what she had built. She looked at the single cup on the shelf. She thought that a man who truly did not care would not live like this. Would not keep growth reports in a locked box with a key on a cord around his neck. Would not spend 2 nights in a waiting room with shaking hands. A man who truly did not care would have let himself off more easily. Calder cooked without talking, which she appreciated. He moved around the small space with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was and had no need to perform the knowing. Whatever he was making smelled simple and good. Something with grain and something with protein and something that had herbs in it from the smell. Walt and Arn talked quietly between themselves. Station talk, route talk, the kind of easy conversation that filled space without demanding anything from anyone nearby. Sarah sat and was quiet and nobody asked her to be otherwise. When the food was ready, Calder put it on the table and sat down in the chair that had always been his, the one slightly closer to the cooking unit, and for a moment all 4 of them just sat around a table that was slightly too small for 4 people and looked at the food. Then Walt picked up his fork and started eating and the meal began. It was Calder who spoke first. He looked at Sarah across the small table and he asked, "What are you good at?" She looked up from her plate. "Not a test," he said immediately. I want to know what you're good at." It was such a specific question. Not how are you or what have you been doing with your life, both of which would have been too large to answer at a table this small. Just, what are you good at? Something concrete. Something she could actually answer. She thought about it. Navigation, she said. I have a good sense of position in space. My elders said it was a Virith trait but stronger in me than most. She paused. I am good at reading situations. Rooms. People. Understanding what is happening underneath what appears to be happening. Calder nodded, listening. I am good at carrying things a long way without putting them down, she added. She had not meant that last one to mean what it also meant. But it did mean what it also meant, and all 4 of them at the table knew it and nobody commented on it, which was the right response. Your mother was like that, Calder said quietly. The navigation. She always knew where she was. In the mines she was the one everyone followed when the markers failed. Sarah went still. He had not mentioned her mother before. She had not asked. It had felt like too much to ask alongside everything else. Tell me, she said. He did. He talked about her mother for a long time. Her name, her work, the way she moved and the way she laughed and the things she said that stuck in the mind. He talked about how they had met and what she had been like and what it had been like to know her. He talked about the mining collapse in a plain and careful way, not lingering on the worst of it but not skipping it either. Sarah listened to every word. She was hearing about herself in a way she had never been able to before. Not just who she came from, but what she had inherited. The navigation. The reading of rooms. The carrying things a long way without putting them down. She had always thought of those traits as simply hers. Things that had come from nowhere, or from her elders' teaching, or from her own effort. Now she understood they had come from somewhere. From someone. From 2 someones, in fact. The meal finished slowly the way good meals do, with nobody rushing to end it. Walt pushed back from the table and said something about checking on the ship's fuel reading, which was almost certainly not necessary but gave the table room to breathe. Arn collected the cups and washed them at the small basin in the corner, quiet and helpful in the way he had been the whole journey. That left Sarah and Calder at the table. She had the letter in her jacket. She had taken it from the box before coming inside, folded it carefully, put it away. She had not read it yet. She was not ready to read it yet and she had decided that was acceptable, that she could take it with her and read it when she was somewhere quiet and alone and had the space to receive whatever was in it. "I am not ready to say that everything is resolved," she told him, direct as she always was. "I want you to know that. I did not come here and find a box of papers and suddenly have no feelings about the years before the box." "I know," Calder said. "But," she said, and she paused, choosing the next words carefully, "I came here thinking I knew what I would find. I was wrong about what I would find. That matters." He looked at her across the table. His gray-brown eyes were doing the same thing they had been doing since he turned around in the yard and saw her, holding on, carefully, like someone who had been given something they were afraid to grip too hard in case it broke. "I would like to know you," he said, "if you are willing. Not to replace anything you have. Not to ask for anything I haven't earned. Just to know you. However much of that you want to allow." She considered him for a long moment. "We will exchange calm frequencies," she said finally. "We will start there. No promises beyond that." He nodded. "No promises beyond that. If I send a message," she said, "you will answer it." "Yes." "And if you send one," she said, "I will decide whether to answer it." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was close to it. "That's fair," he said. The goodbyes were not long. Arn shook Calder's hand at the door of the shop, and something passed between them. Two men who had both been present at the beginning of something a long time ago and were glad to see it had found its way here. No words were needed for it and none were used. Walt shook Calder's hand too, and when Calder reached into his jacket and pulled out payment for the transport, Walt looked at the money and then looked at Calder and shook his head once and walked back toward the ship. Calder watched him go with the expression of a man who wanted to argue and understood arguing would be pointless. Sarah was last. She stood in front of Calder in the yard of the repair shop and they looked at each other in the pale afternoon light of Veritha's reach. She did not know what to do with her hands, which was unusual for her. She was not a person who was normally uncertain about her hands. She settled on giving him the same thing he had given her at the table. Something direct. Something true. "You should have reached sooner," she said. "Yes," he said. "Don't wait again." He held her gaze. "I won't." She nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward the ship. Walt lifted off without ceremony the way he did everything. The colony dropped away below them, the fields going small and then smaller, the buildings shrinking to dots in the wide flat landscape. Sarah sat in the passenger seat and looked out the viewport and watched Veritha's reach get smaller. She could see the repair shop at the edge of the settlement. She could see a figure standing outside it. She raised one hand toward the viewport. Below, the figure raised his back. She kept her hand up until the colony was too small to see anymore. Then she lowered it and looked at her lap and breathed slowly. Walt said nothing. Arn said nothing. The ship turned west and the stars came out ahead of them as the colony's sun fell behind, and the quiet of open space settled around the small cabin like something familiar. Sarah reached to her belt. She touched the handle of the blade. Did not draw it. Just touched it. The worn smooth handle, shaped over years to fit her grip exactly, carrying two sets of initials pressed into the metal near the base. She had carried it her whole life as a wound. She would carry it now as something else. She did not have a perfect word for what it was yet. But it was hers, completely and without question hers, and it was also the proof of a connection that had never actually broken, only gone quiet for a long time, the way some things go quiet without ending. She rested her hand on it and looked at the stars ahead. The quiet of the cabin, the quiet of the journey, the quiet that came after a long search finally finding what it was looking for. It did not feel empty. It had never felt empty like this before. Quiet had always meant absence to her. The space where something was missing. This quiet was different. This quiet had weight. Warm weight. The weight of a box full of growth reports and rough pencil drawings. The weight of a letter folded many times in her jacket pocket. The weight of a calm frequency saved under a name she was still learning how to say. She let herself sit in it. Walt set the course and the ship moved west through the dark and Sarah closed her eyes and for the first time in as long as she could remember, the place inside her that had always felt unfinished was not asking its question anymore. It was not fixed. She was not going to call it fixed. But it was quiet in a way that felt for the first time like enough.